And what a coincidence, it's somebody I know. So tonight's main speaker, Anthony Grimes, is also the executive director of our Virginia affiliate organization. And he'll tell you a little bit about that. I don't have this bio in front of me because I can't read what's in here. But kind of like Emily, I'll tell you a few summary stories. Anthony was an operator in Virginia. We had a small affiliate organization that a long-time recovery advocate had helped set up. But they hadn't been able to make any headway with the state government getting funding, getting recognition. And they got a little money somehow, and were able to convince Anthony that, hey, we don't really have enough money to hire an executive director, but we got enough to pay you for about a year if you think you can earn your salary in new money. And boy, has he. So Virginia went from a struggling little organization in the Richmond area to now a real force for recovery in Richmond and the rest of Virginia. And now he and his organization have become people we rely on when the state wants our help at NAR. We call Anthony and say, hey, we got a new project. So I'd like to introduce Anthony Grimes.
Well, good evening, everyone. I'm not hearing a whole lot of energy in the room, man. Is everybody awake? Are we doing I mean, come on. Look, Dan told me that y'all at Archway know how to celebrate, man, but I ain't hearing a whole lot of celebrating yet. How about this? I'm not going to talk till y'all get loud. All right, so before we get started, right, I want to tell y'all a little story, right? So, and I don't even think that John and Emily know this, but John and Emily, Suki had asked me to come and speak tonight, right? And I told them yes because I rarely turn anything down, and my wife hates it, and I have to live with it, but it's okay. I do have a spare bedroom, if you're concerned. And so, they asked me, and I said yes, and then I looked at my calendar, and I realized that my best friend's bachelor party is this weekend, and there was no way I could miss it. And so I began to look into Archway and do my research. I knew enough, but I wanted to know more. And after reading about the work that all of you all do, your commitment, your passion, I was able to move mountains and move that bachelor party to next weekend. So, and then the other thing is that I was really excited to be here because John had told me that y'all had a national speaker coming in. It was the first time that they had really asked for a national speaker to come in, right? So I was a little curious, and I was actually really excited to know who was speaking. I'd been to a lot of conferences. So last night, I was with John. He invited me to a little dinner with him and Dan and Jan and Emily. And so I pulled John aside and I said, John, I'm looking at this run a show from Emily. I said, I'll be damned if I don't see any national speaker on here. And he goes, it's you, right? And so I say that to say, right, that like, just because an individual has some recovery time, right, my brain still tells me that I don't belong to be up here, that I don't have anything to offer. If any of you are in recovery, support recovery, you know what I'm talking about, right? It's the simple fact that while I've been in recovery for many years and certainly done many things, and certainly my brain knows I'm qualified, right? There's another part of my brain that tells me I'm not qualified, I'm a POS, I don't belong up here, and I don't have anything to offer, right? And so I just say that to say that as we're going about our daily work, our daily lives, let's not forget to check in on people that have substantial recovery time, right? Because we all need support, right? And so, really, I also want to take this time to dedicate these next 10 or 15 minutes, right? I want to dedicate that time that I'm up here, right? I want to dedicate this to a very special individual and a family, right? And I want to do that because I'm not so sure who the individual is or who the family is, right? But what I do know is that somewhere in the United States right now, at this very moment in time, there's an individual struggling with a substance use disorder. There's a family at their wit's end that doesn't know what to do, and they have no idea that none of this exists, right? That still exists in our country today, right? And so I'm saying this to outline the reality of what we're all doing here, right? What we're all doing here is we're celebrating ARCHway. We're celebrating the work that they've done, the growth that they've had, right? And oftentimes when we grow, we always have to ask ourselves, because I ask myself this often, am I still in line with my mission? Am I still carrying out what we intended to do? And as we grow larger with organizations, sometimes it feels like we're getting removed from that first-hand experience. But I'm here to tell you today that my belief in recovery is that I don't want any individual suffering from an SUD not knowing that there's resources. And I certainly don't want any family that doesn't know how to get some help for their loved one. And so when I frame it like that, I feel a responsibility. I feel that fire reignite to continue the work that we're all doing collectively together. And I say we because not one person, not two people are going to solve this addiction crisis that's in our country. It's going to be the communities. It's going to be the individuals. It's going to be the families. It's going to be the people not in recovery that care about recovery, that help us get where we need to go. And I also, I had this thought, right? Yeah, y'all can clap. I mean, Dan and James told me y'all were a lively group, but I'm starting to wonder about them too at this point. So we'll see. And I also want to bring this up, right? Because I'm a person in long-term recovery. My name's Anthony. In some other settings, I might identify myself differently, right? But it wasn't lost on me last night after we had that wonderful meal together, and I went back and I thought about my mother, right? I come from a family who every male in my family, every male has been an alcoholic or an addict since 1910. That's how far we can date the disease of addiction back in our family. And growing up, I had no idea that I was predisposed or that my family had any sort of bloodline that could indicate that I may be predisposed to addictive behaviors, right? I didn't know about that. Nobody knew how to talk to me about that. My dad, subsequently enough, he found recovery when I was about 12 years old, and he's still in recovery to this day. So actually, my first recovery experience was in St. Louis, right? It was in 1996, and there's a 12-step fellowship by the name of Narcotics Anonymous that had a world convention here in 1996, right? That convention was called Show Me How to Live, and I was 12 years old. And it was the first time I went to a world convention. And I went with my dad. And so what I learned through that experience, right, was I was a kid running around in the 12-step meetings, right? And what I came to realize was that as I grew up, right, I really felt like I had all of the information in the world about recovery, and I really thought it was going to help me be the first successful drug user in our country system. That was what I thought I had in store, because I always thought that I was a pretty sharp guy, right? And I thought about, I've been sitting in these meetings, getting all this wonderful information, man, I'm going to do this, man. And it didn't work out so well. And so, it's still not lost on me, because I called my mother today, and I thanked her, right? And I thanked her because I've made a mess of my life in many, many areas. I'm here to tell each and every one of you here today that while I am a person in long-term recovery, I'm also a chronic relapse. I was the person who everybody thought would never get it. And there was even a point in my life, right? I'm 30 years old, right? And I had really come to the conclusion and actually made peace with it that I would die with a needle in my arm as a drug user. That was what I thought my life would be at 30 years old. And so my using career led to lots of incarceration. That's part of my story. I am a person that's been formerly incarcerated. And it's interesting, right, because I would come around the recovery community when I wasn't ready to get help yet, And the recovery community would always tell me these awesome little sayings, like, keep coming back. We love you. You belong here, right? But in normal society, when I would make a mess, they would always put handcuffs on me, and they'd always say United States of America versus Anthony Grimes, and that really wasn't a comforting feeling, right? And then they asked me how much money I had. I didn't have any money, so I quickly learned that if you don't have any money and you're involved in the justice system, you're not in very good shape. And so even back then, right, one thing I learned in my brain, right, was that when I mess up in society, society will lock me up. When I mess up in the recovery community, they tell me they love me and keep coming back. But when they don't see me for a while, they forget about me. But the people who never gave up on me, right? My mother, my father, right? Every time I was incarcerated, I didn't ask for money, right? But one thing that always happened was that my mother put money on that telephone and I called every Sunday, right? And that's important, right? Because I think that as we look at recovery as a whole, right? It's not just one piece that makes recovery happen, right? And I'm here to tell you all today that family supporters, caregivers, those are the backbone of our recovery system, right? And so, we're going to talk a little bit, right? We're going to talk a little bit about ecosystems of recovery. Y'all ever heard of that? Have y'all ever heard of a recovery ecosystem? Well, years ago, SAMHSA came up with this thing, right, called the ROS, the Recovery Oriented System of Care. And everybody thought it was going to be the next best thing, it was going to be so great, and it really was cool. And then they didn't do anything with it for 10 years, right? Well, fast forward, now they're going to revisit that, but the thing is that our communities have moved beyond the ROS. Now we're talking about recovery ecosystems, and we're going to touch on that a little bit because what I believe is that I believe that Archway is uniquely positioned to be the community connector that brings recovery ecosystems, full continuums of care all across this country, right? And so, as Dave mentioned, right, I began my using career at a relatively young age. I grew up in a family that was really centered in recovery. I used that information to be the best drug user I could be. It didn't work out very well. It ended up being incarcerated and all sorts of things happened. And I'm sure if you're in recovery, you know how to use drugs and make a mess of your life just like I do. So I'll fast forward most of that, right? But what I do want to get to is the recovery, right? So I have been involved in a recovery community, right? And all these things that when we're looking for help, we think John helped me out or Dave helped me out, but we forget that what we're actually being given is free services. These are actually services that are provided within communities that we just think somebody's helped us, but they're actually services, right? And so that's very, very important because one of the services that I got when I was trying to find recovery was recovery housing. I had access to a recovery center, and some people say, well, what's a recovery center, right? And so we have them in Virginia. We've got about 15 of them statewide, but what they really are they're like community centers. Are y'all familiar with what a Boys and Girls Club is, right? You see Boys and Girls Club, their mission is to have a safe place for kids after school, right? They help with their homework, shoot hoops in the gym, right? Well, that's what a recovery community center is. A recovery community center oftentimes hosts mutual aid meetings, they have peer trainings, they have support, but most importantly, what people in recovery know about a recovery center is that no matter what's going on, it's a safe place they can go and be amongst like-minded individuals, right? And the value of what a recovery center brings to its community is immeasurable, right? It's so profound, in fact, that we haven't even begun to quantify the metrics on it. And so, when I got out of incarceration, I went to a recovery house because I knew when I was locked up that if I was going to have any opportunity to find success on the outside, I would have to immediately go to a recovery house, bed-to-bed transfer. And the interesting thing is that when I was incarcerated the last time, I had left the recovery organization I was at. I knew I had some warrants out. And my mother had taken me, of course, there's only a family left at that point, right? My mother had taken me to turn myself in, and then I was sent to a solitary confinement because I was so sick, and I was staying there for over 30 days detoxing. It was the last time I detoxed, and I'll never forget it. And when they took me to the pod that I was going to, and I got into this pod, and I go up these stairs in this tier, I looked at who my bunkmate was, and it was my father. I had been sent to the same pod in the same jail that my father was currently in. And my father was in that jail because he had had a reoccurrence of abuse after about 20 years and really made a mess of his life. And so one of the things that happened was that I was able to share some of my hopes and dreams with my father in that incarcerated setting, in that moment. And it may seem like an awful odd place to have dreams emerge, right? You know, you're with your father, you're incarcerated together, drug crimes, right? And I'll tell you what I told my father I was going to do. I told him, I said, Dad, I don't know how I'm going to do this. I said, but when I get out, I said, I've been in a lot of recovery houses. I'm going to start a recovery house. And I'm here to tell you that 2 years after I was released from that incarcerated setting, I started my first recovery house. And from there, right? And from there, when I got out and I began to get involved in the recovery community, right? Some of these mutual aid fellowships, they have things called a sponsor. I don't know if y'all are familiar with that terminology, right? But it's essentially somebody that you ask to help guide you in your recovery process, right? And so I knew enough about recovery to know that I needed to be thinking differently than I had in the past. So I asked an individual to sponsor me who I knew from the recovery community. Now if you know anything about how newcomers in recovery think, right? We all want the sponsor that sounds the best, maybe drives the best car, right? You know, that's what we're looking for in a sponsor. I'm new, right? I want the best Sharon, this MFer in town, right? I want to, man, that guy can drive a mean piece, right? The question is, can he live, right? You know what I mean? So I picked my sponsor because he had a healthy relationship with his wife. That was the main reason I picked my sponsor. And what my sponsor told me was, he told me that if I was going to have any success in recovery, then I needed to find myself a home group. And I didn't realize it at the time, but you know, when he told me to pick a home group, he told me that I needed to be at that meeting every week. And I wasn't exactly sure why, but I did. And then I realized 2 years later, I was speaking in a jail meeting. This is a meeting that happens inside of a jail. I was asked to be the speaker, and there was a young lady that came in and sat in the front row. And if you hear her tell the story, I had been stalking her. If you hear me tell it, she had been stalking me. The truth's somewhere in the middle. But I'm here to tell you that speaking at that jail meeting is where I met my wife at, right? And when I told my sponsor I was going to ask her to marry me, he said, do you remember the spiritual principle of commitment we talked about when you selected that home group? That's the same spiritual principle you need to ask that woman to marry you. That's the power of recovery, right? We're talking about living better. We're talking about spiritual principles, right? We're talking about being guided along. And so it was that experience in early recovery that led me to want to apply for that job. I've been a recovery house operator. This job comes open. And then the president of the board, David Rook at the time, he looks at me and he says, you know, you're the first person to ever apply to be an ARC state affiliate executive director that's not college educated. You know that, right? He said that to me. I said, oh, Lord. Right? Because the conviction that I felt when that job came open was I had a lucrative construction business. I was a small-time business, but I did renovations. I was making a good living. I was able to support this new wife that I had in our family. And I shut all of that down 2 weeks before I ever applied for the job. Shut it down. That was the conviction I felt in my heart, right? I felt the God of my understanding telling me that that's what I was supposed to be doing. Now, my wife, she didn't quite want to hear all that. You know, she wanted to know how I was going to pay the mortgage next month, but that's another story. So, I did this job at bar, right? They do the interview panel, right? The president of the board says, you are not the best candidate for this job. The best candidate's got a college degree, vast nonprofit experience, but there's a problem. I said, what's the problem, Dave? They said, that guy's not in recovery, and that guy doesn't understand our space, and you do. We're picking you. And so, And so if you don't know, people in recovery can oftentimes feel intimidated in professional settings because they don't have college educations. But I'm going to tell you what, their lived experience is better than any college degree I can find in this country. And so I get this job, right, and they turn over the finances to me, and they hired me at an amount, and they told me that they could cover it, and then they turned over all the books to me, and they had less than half the money of what my year's salary was in the bank. So I go home and I tell my wife, and needless to say, I was sleeping on the couch. And then I began to build relationships, right? I learned about part of this space is not just about the work you do, but it's about the relationships that you build. So I began to build a relationship with our state agency because this is the way I see it. In the recovery space, you have private funding, self-pay, insurance, and government funding. Now, the way I feel, Virginia gets a little over $108 million a year in government funding for addiction services directly from the federal government through SAMHSA. The way I see it is that that money belongs in our space. So yes, I'm going to keep fighting for it. I'm going to keep advocating for it because that's the money that should be supporting our ecosystem, right? And so I began to advocate, and prior to really getting any funding, there was a recovery mentor I had. He's passed away now, but he calls me up and he says, how are you going to get me data? And I heard Don talking about some data earlier. It was really perked my ears up. And so he taught me into implementing a recovery capital data platform, and it's based on evidence-based science. And he gave me a free pilot, and I implemented this thing all across all of our certified beds in Virginia. And the rest of the NAR executive directors across the country called me and told me that I was absolutely insane, that I had been in this job all of 6 months, and now I'm going to mandate a data platform for my providers without incentivizing them, and that they all just succumb to the fact that I'd be fired in a month, and Virginia would move along as business as usual. Well, I'm here to tell you today that we got that data platform implemented, and I'm here to tell you that we got over 80% of our provider group to use it without incentivizing them, and I'll tell you why they used it. They used it because what I told each and every one of those providers was, I believe if we do this together, if you all as service providers stop viewing each other as competition, start viewing each other as collaborators, start viewing each other as your colleagues and not your competition, right? And keep in mind that the main reason why we're all coming together is to support the individual with a substance use disorder that hasn't found any help yet. That's why we're all in this room. So I said, I believe, right? I said, I believe if we implement this data platform, then we can do things that no other state has ever done. And I told my provider group this. I believe this is our key. And I also know that relationships with state agencies, they go up and down because administrations change, politicians change, governors change, right? And so you're constantly looking for how you're going to sustain this organization. So I made a decision early on that I was going to build a relationship within the Virginia General Assembly and our elected legislators. Because I realized something, that they actually appropriate the state budget. So they actually have a little bit of influence to possibly help us. So I'm here to tell you today that we got a budget amendment in 2020 for $500,000, $250,000 a year for the next 2 years. At this point in time, we had just looked at our statewide data, and we realized that in real time in our beds, we were serving over an 81% Caucasian population in our beds. And now, being an operator and a person in recovery, and certainly a person that had been incarcerated, I knew that there was something wrong with those numbers, and I knew that we had an issue, right? To Don's point, you got to get the data to see where the gap is, right? We got the data, saw where the gap was. I immediately went to work at the Virginia General Assembly, letting them know that I needed money for an indigent bed program because I believe the issue lies with financial barriers to access recovery housing. So we got that $750,000, and the data that funding approved from an indigent bed program, our numbers went from 81% Caucasian being served to 70%, which means that we had increased access for minority populations by over 11% with a relatively small amount of funding. for a statewide network. So we took that data back to the General Assembly, and we got a direct line item allocation to ARC for $10 million. Now this is a nonprofit that only had $750,000 to its name, about $10 million. So I'm here to tell you today that we collected data on that, and I'm here to tell you that our indigent vet program went to 55% Caucasian, 45% minority population being served, right? Why am I telling you this? Why am I telling you this? I'm telling you this because Don hit the nail on the head. We have got to get some data, right? Now, this guy right here that doesn't have a college education, been called many, many worse names than uneducated in my life, right? I've authored 3 published research papers showing the efficacy of recovery data in Virginia because of that data platform. We have evidence-based science to take to our state agency, and when you look through this beautiful research paper, you know what it says? It says that recovery works, and recovery is happening in the state of Virginia, and recovery is happening in Missouri, and recovery is happening all across the country. So as I begin to kind of wrap this up, and I'm just so thankful and grateful for the work that Jane and Dan have done, John and Emily. I mean, it's just truly amazing, right? But I want to share with you all that the work's not done yet. That the work is not done yet, right? You know, I get to travel different places, and I get to talk about recovery. Most of the time it's with the PowerPoint, data, and all sorts of cool stuff, right? This is a little different, and I love it. But, you know, I go from place to place, and I see all these different individuals, right? And I wonder how many of them know their history, or how many of them really look at the history of our country. And I want to bring something to y'all's attention. Some of y'all are young, and I know I'm too young to remember, but I do my research. And I want to bring us back to a time, the Vietnam War. Some of you are old enough to remember that, and some of you certainly remember what it was like. But I can tell you, we had an 8-year period in the Vietnam War. And after 6 years, the entire country in the United States was outraged at the amount of lives that were lost. Our brothers, our sisters, our community members, our friends, our family. The entire country was outraged after 6 years. Do you know how many people we lost in Vietnam? A little over 40,000. You know how many we lost from substance use disorder last year? Over 105,000. Where's the outrage now? Where's the outrage? This is a call to action. I'm not a comedian. I'm up here to call y'all to action, man. We need your help. ARCHway needs your help. NPRA needs your help. NAR needs your help. This is what I believe. I've got the data in Virginia. I need y'all to help me to get some more data in some other places, right? This is what I believe. I believe if we engage on this journey together, showing the powers that be that recovery works, that recovery housing works, peers work, we're not treatment, we're support, and we work. And I believe that if we can do those things together, collectively, this is the beginning of a new day where the people in this room connected with ARCHway are going to begin a revolution in this country that changes our healthcare system.
Yeah. All right.
Because recovery and substance use disorder is not a moral deficiency, it's a healthcare issue. We don't have a criminal justice problem. We have a healthcare problem. Can you imagine a world anywhere where if you needed to have your foot looked at where you couldn't find a foot doctor? There are communities across this country where it is not acceptable to talk about recovery. There are communities across this country where the local government feels that people who have a substance use disorder deserve to be incarcerated. This is not the mindset that gets us to a solution. And I also want to impress upon everybody one thing. We, as a community, have been doing the best we can with what we have to work with. And it almost feels as if we've been doing just enough as if we're going to wait for the government to come in and save the day. Well, I'm here to tell you folks, the government is not coming in to save the day, nor do we want them to come in and save the day, because in my experience, And in my community, they told me that it would take a village to raise a child, but it would take a community to fight addiction. So what I'm telling you here today is we've got the right community in the room. Now let's work together, and I'm going to ask each and every one of you whether you can, any way you can support Archway, NPRA, and the work that's going on. Look, even if it's just something as simple as talking about recovery and mental health with a group of people that you would normally, you wouldn't even say those words to. I'm just asking each and every one of you that when you go out and you leave here tonight and you go about your daily life, talk about recovery. Make recovery mainstream. Do you know what happens, right? Because all of your tax dollars are being appropriated right now. As we speak, the government's appropriating it to addiction services, and unfortunately, it's all going to treatment and not recovery, right? That's just a reality. But that's our money. We're all taxpayers, right? So what if we, through Archway, which is this large community connector organization, they just connect people, connect communities, right? Well, what if we all start demanding that our funding be used for recovery? What if we tell the individuals who are running for local office that that's where we want our money put? What I'm trying to tell you all today is that we've got a lot of work done, but we already have the infrastructure. We've got a plan. We've got a recovery ecosystem that combines peer support, family support, recovery centers, and recovery housing. And I have data that shows that the outcomes on those things are better than if somebody goes to treatment. So I'm going to leave y'all with one last thing, right? Our newest data that's going to be published, right? We actually did an in-depth study on costs to the consumer, right? Now I know healthcare funds really care about what does it cost, right? So I'm here to tell you that the average person in Virginia visits a Medicaid treatment center to the tune of $20,000 approximately 7 times in a calendar year. That's the average for somebody who's still in active use. But if you take that person and they engage in a treatment episode immediately followed by bar-certified recovery housing, it goes down to only 3 treatment episodes within that calendar year, which according to my math, we have saved our government over $100,000, right? And so this is the type of information, these are the talking points. This is what we need to do if we're really going to have a much larger impact than we've already had. And I don't mean that for Archway, I mean us as a society. I mean, really, when you live and you work in this space, you wonder how it's gotten to where it's at, right? But then you come to places like this, right? And you see the hope, right? You see Emily up here talking about it's not by coincidence that we're here, right? You've got Dan trying to change my entire speech last night at dinner, which I wasn't going to say that, right? You've got John calling just this recovery guy a national figure, right? Look, man, I'm here to tell you, man, that the power lies within our community. The power lies within us. We are the ones who are going to help our neighbors. We are the ones who are going to help our families. And we are the ones who are going to come together and solve the addiction crisis in our country. I'm a firm believer in that. Thank you all for having me.